If you have ever stood in front of a piece of abstract art, or gazed at a mountain vista, or listened to a piece of music, and felt that singular, undeniable, universal feeling we call beauty, you have stumbled right into the philosophical heart of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment.
And if you wondered why that feeling felt so commanding, so necessary, as if everyone ought to agree with you, even though you intellectually knew the pleasure you were experiencing was entirely subjective, then you are absolutely ready for this.
Yeah, you are ready for a rigorous deep dive into Kant's Analytic of the Beautiful.
hmm
That is our mission today, to provide you with the shortcut, really, to understanding Kant's incredibly rigorous architecture for defining the pure judgment of taste. We are looking at how he managed to execute this revolutionary move.
It really was.
He shifted the entire concept of beauty away from the qualities of the object being judged and relocated it squarely within the very form of the judgment itself.
And he breaks this down into four incredibly interdependent moments, which are, they're the building blocks of this entire transcendental system.
Okay, so before we jump into moment one, it's crucial to set the stage. What are we not doing here?
Right. It is crucial to understand that our analysis is not. It's not concerned with empirical psychology. We aren't cataloging existing beautiful things or, taking a survey of what people actually like.
So no focus groups.
No, none. We are strictly formulating the intellectual meaning of what a pure judgment of taste could possibly be. An ideal judgment that is completely distinct and belongs to its own unique class.
Its own category.
Yes. In Latin, we'd call this sui generis. We are constructing the ideal conception, whether anyone actually, lays down such a judgment perfectly in the real world or not.
So we are defining the rules of the game before the players even step onto the field. And that formulation, that definition of the ideal judgment, is exactly where this whole Kantian revolution in aesthetics began.
It is.
It's often compared to the revolution Copernicus brought to astronomy because it radically changed the perspective, the center of gravity of the whole field.
Historically, before Kant, the general assumption held by philosophers like Wolff and Baumgarten was that beauty was an objective quality. It was something that lived in the object itself.
They were looking outward, in other words.
Exactly. They all recognize that when we perceive beauty, there is a striving after an ideal or a certain kind of perfection. They sought the ideal of beauty in some perfection, some organization, or some established rule in the physical object.
Can you give us an example? Like, what would they point to?
Sure. For example, in architecture, they might assume that a judgment of taste concerns objective qualities like, say, adherence to the golden ratio, or perfect symmetry, or even just functional integrity.
So if the object achieved some measure of that perfection, it was beautiful.
That was the idea. They assumed a judgment of taste was just a type of cognitive judgment, even if it was maybe a confused or obscure one.
Okay, so they were basically saying, finding beauty is like finding a perfect diamond. The diamond's perfection is external and measurable, even if my judgment of that perfection is a bit fuzzy or non-scientific.
Correct. But this is where Kant delivers his knockout blow. He argued that seeking perfection in the object, even if you allowed for that perfection to be perceived in a confused way, which was the common philosophical sort of proviso,
Right.
it still didn't make the resulting judgment distinctive or unique. A judgment concerning what is objective does not stop being logical or cognitive just because the concepts involved are a little vague or obscure.
That is the pivotal insight. If beauty is fundamentally about cognition, even confused cognition, then it's just poor philosophy. It's a failed attempt at objective truth. It's not its own unique field of human experience.
Precisely. To make aesthetics sui generis, Kant had to change the terrain entirely. He placed the ideal not in the perfection of the object, but in the form of the judgment itself.
Wow.
So the question shifted radically from what objective quality ought the object to possess
To what must the necessary structure of the judgment of the beautiful be?
You got it. Purity of judgment was substituted for perfection of the object.
So we are no longer analyzing beautiful things. We are analyzing the necessary a priori conditions required for any subjective statement of beauty to carry the authority it seems to claim.
And this framework leads us directly into the systemic structure of the analytic of the beautiful. Kant formulates this conception of a pure aesthetic judgment by constantly distinguishing the beautiful from its close cousins, the agreeable.
Which is just private pleasure, like I like this food.
Right. And the good, which involves concepts of purpose or moral value. The definition is proven by this distinction provided, of course, that the required judgment is even possible.
This systematic proof sounds less like a simple list and more like a tight philosophical circle as our source notes. So how do these four moments relate to each other?
Well, they're not four linear steps you check off sequentially. That's a common misunderstanding. There are four interdependent conditions where the entire structure is validated internally. If you accept the first moment,
It requires the second.
it requires the second then demands the conditions of the third, and so on.
Wait, can you elaborate on this interdependence? That's incredibly difficult to grasp when first approaching Kant. Why does one moment presuppose the next?
Okay, think of it like this. If I make a pure judgment of taste, I have to prove I was disinterested. That's moment one.
No personal gain.
Right. Now, if I prove my delight was disinterested, it means the delight wasn't based on private personal conditions. Therefore, the ground of my delight must be universal, which forces me to adopt the universal voice. That's moment two.
Okay, I'm with you.
But if I claim universal validity without using a concept, what am I communicating? I must be communicating something that belongs to cognition generally, which forces me to look for the subjective ground of finality. Moment three. And finally, because I am appealing to a universal yet non-conceptual ground, I must presuppose a shared cognitive structure common to all humanity, the common sense, or sensus communis. And that's moment four.
So the philosophical necessity of meeting condition X forces you to invent or presuppose condition Y. The entire structure is a systematic chain of necessary justification, leading eventually to that idea of a sensus communis as the final, ultimate presupposition.
That's it. That dynamic relationship is what guides our entire deep dive.
So let's start where he does.
And that brings us to the famous starting point, moment one.
Okay, let's unpack this with the first moment, which is the necessary starting gate for purity, disinterestedness. This is probably the most widely known feature of Kantian aesthetics, right?
It is, and he starts here because it fundamentally defines the essential meaning of the judgment for the self, and it immediately establishes the judgment as distinct from the practical and moral faculties.
So let's get his abstract definition first. What exactly is an interest in the Kantian sense?
Kant's definition of interest is delight, combined with the representation of the existence of an object. Interest is tethered to desire, to utility, and to the will. If you have an interest, you want the object to exist, and possibly to possess it.
So let's use a simple litmus test. If I see a piece of land and think, that's beautiful, I must buy it and build a house there, the pleasure I feel is interested.
It is because it relates to the object's existence and your desire for practical engagement.
Okay.
Or if I judge a magnificent old clock and think, what beautiful craftsmanship, and I bet it's worth a fortune, that is also interested. The pure judgment of taste must be entirely abstracted from this desire or utility.
So what is left?
What's left is mere contemplative pleasure or passive satisfaction. It is a delight that clings to the idea of the form only, independent of the object's reality or its existence.
So a judgment tinged with interest, then, is necessarily partial, personal, and concerned with practical consequences.
Exactly. It fails the test of purity. And while Kant gets the credit for systemizing this, it's important to acknowledge that this concept of aesthetic disinterest wasn't entirely novel. He didn't just invent it out of thin air.
Oh, interesting. So where did he pick up this thread, historically?
Well, the concept was bubbling up for decades in both continental and British philosophy. Thomas Aquinas had touched on it, sure, but Moses Mendelssohn really brought clear attention to it in the 18th century.
Mendelssohn, okay.
Mendelssohn distinguished approving, or the satisfaction of the soul, as lying uniquely between mere knowing and actively desiring. He specifically noted that we contemplate beauty with quiet satisfaction, far removed from the desire to possess it or put it to use.
That really captures the unique neutrality of aesthetic experience. You can admire a dangerous predator at a safe distance, a tiger, say, and experience its fearful beauty without desiring its existence to end or, to take it home as a pet.
Exactly. Yeah. But the clearest precursor, though, was probably Francis Hutcheson in Britain. His inquiry emphasized that pleasure and beauty is immediate and sensory, entirely independent of utility, advantage, or detriment.
So it's not about what the thing does.
No. Hutcheson stressed that even the most accurate knowledge of an object's usefulness wouldn't change our perception of its beauty or deformity. The judgment is involuntary, it's honest, and it's uncorrupted by external pressures.
You can't be bribed into finding something beautiful.
You can't. Hutcheson noted that no amount of threats or rewards could make us approve a deformed object or disapprove a beautiful one, even if they could coerce our external behavior. Beauty affects us directly and immediately, without reflection on reason or relation to ourselves, reward, or possession.
So Kant took this established concept, the honesty and impartiality of aesthetic experience, and made it the absolute cornerstone of his transcendental framework.
Yes, he gave it its systematic place.
Let's use the source as analogies to make this disinterestedness more visceral. Starting with the picture gallery test. How do we spot an interested judgment in the wild?
The picture gallery test is instructive precisely because it highlights our tendency to contaminate the judgment. If you observe the average gallery-goer, they often judge the work based on external interested criteria.
Like what?
Well, if a critic refuses to see beauty in a still life because they believe the subject matter, say, a bowl of common fruit is mean or low, they are betraying a partial interested judgment.
Ah, so they are judging the existence or the moral value of the object depicted, rather than the form and execution of the depiction itself.
Exactly. The purity required means the artist, in terms of form, makes all things beautiful in their time. If I dismiss a masterful genre painting because I believe the subject is politically trivial or morally distasteful, my critique isn't about its aesthetic form.
It's about your own baggage.
Right. It's about my subjective moral or practical concerns regarding the subject's existence. I have failed the first Kantian test. The person who only values a painting because they know its investment potential also fails instantly.
So the person who spends 5 minutes judging a painting based on whether it matches their couch or their stock portfolio fails the Kantian aesthetic purity test instantly.
They haven't even begun the process of reflective judgment. The Aristotle analogy of true friendship illustrates this detachment beautifully as well.
Okay, how does friendship relate to appreciating a vase?
Well, Aristotle defined two types of spurious friendship. One based on utility,
Interesting.
and one based on pleasure, also interest. In both cases, the friend is valued for what you derive from his existence, a benefit or a good feeling.
Right, interested friendship.
Yes. But in true friendship, you love the friend for himself alone, as an alter ego, regardless of whether he provides utility or derived pleasure. Those benefits may exist, but they are not the determining ground of the affection.
So that mirrors the disinterested attitude required for pure taste.
It does. You are appreciating the beautiful object simply for what it is in its form, not for what it does for you.
And finally, the ultimate display of mental detachment, the laughable.
Yes. The ability to take a joke against oneself is regarded as giving great evidence of mental detachment. Even if something in which we have a lively personal interest forms the subject of the joke, we're expected to dissociate ourselves from those interests and just enjoy the joke.
Right, as a structure of wit.
Exactly. The source mentions Socrates rising up during a performance of Aristophanes' The Clouds, a comedy that was satirizing him, to let the Athenians see the man being ridiculed.
That is the ultimate public performance of detachment.
It is. Socrates places his true self beyond the reach of the satire and separates it from the mere external self that became the object of laughter. A good story, or a good joke, is structurally satisfying, whether it is really true or not, and regardless of its personal stakes. That delight is purely contemplative.
That first moment is crystal clear. Beauty is defined by freedom from interest. But if my judgment is merely contemplative, if it's entirely passive, how can it move beyond being just my private feeling? That intense philosophical demand leads us directly into moment two.
It has to.
Universal validity without a concept.
This is the critical transition from the self to the public sphere.
Yes.
Since the judgment has deliberately abstracted from all private conditions because it is disinterested, the ground of the delight must, by logical necessity, be universal.
Okay.
The moment you remove self-interest, you are obligated to adopt a universal standpoint.
I force myself to be impersonal, and in doing so, I automatically speak with a public shared perspective. I'm substituting my personal preferences for an impersonal claim.
That's why Kant calls this speaking with a universal voice. When you say, "This rose is beautiful," you are not just describing your own internal state, you are demanding universal agreement.
You're referring to beauty as if it were a property of the object, like a logical predicate that anyone with functional sight should observe.
Yes. And this claim to universality is the source of the great contradiction that utterly defeated previous empirical theories of taste.
How so?
Well, think about the language of taste in food versus taste in art. It would be entirely contradictory to say, "It is beautiful to me." If you only meant that it pleases you, there would be no sense in calling it beautiful. You would simply call it agreeable.
I like this.
Exactly. Agreeableness is inherently private. I like this wine. If I say, this wine is beautiful, I am making an overreach of language because I cannot demand universal agreement on a purely sensory experience.
Right. I can't demand that everyone else agree that my favorite type of cheese is agreeable. But when I call a symphony beautiful, I do expect, or at least I claim the right, that others should feel the same way.
That is the crucial distinction. The actual aesthetic judgment must rest on the idea of the possibility of a judgment capable of being deemed valid for everyone, even if empirically actual agreement is not met.
So we are claiming universality.
Which means the determining ground of our pleasure must be universally communicable.
But if we are prohibited from using definite concepts, since we are judging beauty, not objective perfection, what is it that we are communicating universally? It can't be a concept, but it must be more than just a feeling.
And that's the challenge that this second moment poses and immediately defers to the next two. Kant notes that nothing is capable of being universally communicated but cognition and representations that are necessary for cognition generally.
Why cognition?
Because cognition, or what belongs to it, has an objective reference with which the power of representation of everyone is obliged to harmonize. We all have the same fundamental mental machinery for knowing the world.
I see.
So we know the ground must be objective enough to be communicable, a nod to our shared cognitive faculty, but subjective enough to avoid using any definite concept of the object. The second moment only asserts the claim and the need for this universally communicable ground.
Forcing us to locate what that strange, non-conceptual yet universal ground actually is. Which brings us to moment 3, purposiveness without purpose. This is the most abstract, famous, and sometimes confusing phrase in all of Kantian aesthetics. We are now hunting for the subjective ground of that universal, non-conceptual judgment.
And we have to satisfy two requirements at the same time. First, the ground must refer to cognition for universal communicability from moment 2.
Right.
Second, it must be purely subjective and aesthetic, independent of any definite concept of the object from moment 1.
So the answer cannot be found in the object itself or in a specific concept about the object.
Correct. Therefore, the determining ground can only be the mental state present in the mutual relation of the powers of representation required for cognition in general. It must be something we all share, purely because we are human beings capable of knowing anything at all.
And what are those foundational powers of representation that we all share?
Well, when any object is presented to us and becomes a source of cognition, two faculties have to cooperate. Imagination, which works to bring together and arrange the manifold of intuition, the raw sensory data. And understanding, which supplies the unity of the concept, organizing that data.
So when I look at a chair, my imagination gathers the lines, shapes, and colors. My understanding applies the concept chair, and cognition is achieved. They work together toward a goal.
Exactly. In the aesthetic state, however, we are explicitly prohibiting the application of a definite concept. We are judging its form, not what it is. Consequently, the determining ground is the mental state present in the free play of imagination and understanding.
The free play.
Yes. They are in mutual accord, which is a general requisite for cognition, but they are not constrained by a specific cognitive goal.
So it's the feeling of my mental engines running smoothly and harmoniously, but without having actually manufactured a specific conceptual product.
That's a great way to put it. That is the core of the subjective aesthetic state.
Yeah.
Imagine encountering a challenging piece of abstract sculpture. Your imagination is trying desperately to impose some kind of spatial order on the lines and masses. It's actively grouping and playing with the manifold. Your understanding is hovering, looking for the rule or the concept that will unify it. When suddenly, the form allows the imagination to group the data so easily that it corresponds effortlessly to the general but indefinite lawfulness sought by the understanding, they click into a fast, harmonious, unconstrained rhythm.
They stop fighting and start dancing. That rapid, harmonious, unconstrained rhythm is the pleasure.
Precisely. The accord itself isn't immediately known conceptually. It is reached through purely abstract considerations stemming from the need for disinterested, universal validity.
So how do we become conscious of this accord? Since it's not a concept, it must be experienced viscerally.
It is experienced indirectly through sensation. The quickening of both faculties, their indefinite but harmonious activity, is the sensation whose universal communicability the judgment of taste postulates. This effect upon the mind, this facile, easy play of powers, is what is felt as pleasure.
So the sensation of pleasure doesn't immediately tell me, oh, this is the free play of imagination and understanding. I have to interpret that feeling based on the fact that I have already satisfied the first two moments.
That's critical. You have to be conscious that you have abstracted from everything but the form of the object to determine the sensation's significance. This allows us to define pleasure generally, as Kant does, as the consciousness of the causality of a representation in respect of the subject's state, tending to preserve a continuance of that state.
In the aesthetic context, the state we want to continue is that free, harmonious mental dance.
Which means beauty is the subjective finality in the representation of the object. Finality refers to a structure that appears designed or purpose-built, even if we cannot assign a definite purpose or end for which it was built.
Which gives us the famous phrase,
Purposiveness without purpose, or finality apart from a determinate end.
let's use a natural analogy here. When I look at a naturally occurring perfect crystal or a seashell with an incredible spiral, it looks almost designed, almost manufactured to a high standard, yet I know it serves no definite human purpose or concept. It simply looks,
Right.
right?
That is subjective finality. It is the pleasure derived from our internal harmony projected onto the external object's form. But this brings us to the most difficult part of the critique of taste, solving the priority problem.
Does the feeling of pleasure or the estimate of the object come first?
This is the linchpin. If the pleasure comes first, if the object pleases me, and then I decide to call it beautiful, we fall back into the problem of the agreeable. The judgment would be nothing but an affirmation of the universal communicability of mere agreeableness, which is impossible.
Right. Agreeableness is purely private and sensory. If pleasure is antecedent, the judgment is not pure.
Exactly. So Kant must insist that the object must please because it is beautiful, instead of being judged beautiful because it pleases. The beautiful object is the one whose form causes the necessary conditions for purity.
But doesn't that defy our immediate experience? When I see a sunset, I feel pleasure instantly.
And this is where we must distinguish between immediate sensation and logical priority. Kant states that the reflection upon the given representation precedes the feeling of pleasure as the determining ground. The finality is thought prior to being felt in its effect.
Help me unpack that distinction between logical priority and immediate sensation. Use a conversational example.
Okay, let's go back to the joke analogy. When someone tells you a successful joke, you laugh. The laughter, the pleasure seems instantaneous.
Right.
But what logically precedes the feeling of amusement? It is the fraction of a second when your mind apprehends the premise, recognizes the sudden non-conceptual fit of the punchline, and observes the successful structure of the narrative. That successful structural recognition, the reflection on the joke's finality, is logically prior to the feeling of amusement, which is the consequence.
So the mental act of checking that all the necessary conditions are met. Disinterest, universal applicability, free play is logically required before the pleasure can be validated as pure aesthetic pleasure. The pleasure is the consequence of the mind successfully engaging in this reflection.
That's the essence of the reflective judgment. The capacity for the judgment to be communicated must be fundamental, with the feeling of pleasure as its consequence. The complex logical structure comes first, generating the feeling of pleasure second.
So the mental acrobatics required just to say something is beautiful are astonishing. We are essentially running a deep internal simulation to check for purity before the pleasure is even allowed to register as pure. This highly intellectual act brings us to the ultimate claim of the analysis. Moment 4.
Yes, necessity and the sensus communis.
We've established that we claim universal validity in moment 2, but what gives us the right to demand that agreement? Where does the necessity come from?
Well, the claim to universality and necessity implies the concept of a law. If there's a necessity, there must be a rule.
And the faculty of representing the universal or the law is the understanding.
Right. This implied reference to the understanding is why we refer what we feel to the object as if it belonged to it as a logical predicate. Before the pleasure strikes, we have determined to speak with a universal voice and think of possible conformity of the object to our faculties of cognition.
We are reflecting on the object's ability to conform to our cognitive structure generally.
Yes. And as that contemplation strengthens, as the free play establishes itself, the pleasure arises immediately under these universally valid, self-imposed conditions. And because the pleasure is the result of a necessary mechanism, the accord of our faculties, it seems inevitable.
Okay.
We then transfer this inevitability, this forethought necessity, to the form of the object itself. It seems charged with the necessary meaning.
This gives the judgment its authority, but there's a problem. If the rule governing the harmony of the faculties cannot be formulated conceptually, if I can't write down the exact formula for why the rose is beautiful, what kind of rule is it?
That's the key transcendental move. The rule governing the harmony of imagination and understanding cannot be formulated in a concept. He can only be exemplified. Therefore, what we claim for our judgment is exemplary validity.
Exemplary validity. We are saying, look at this object. It is an example of what ought to please every human mind, because every human mind is structured the same way.
Exactly. We are presenting our judgment as an example of a rule that all human beings, by virtue of their shared universal cognitive structure, ought to follow. And this demand for necessity requires us to presuppose an ideal norm, which is the ultimate foundation of the entire structure.
The common sense, or sensus communis?
Precisely. To entitle us to claim necessity, we must assume this common sense exists.
What is this common sense if it's not simply what most people agree on?
It's not an external sense, but a subjective principle that determines, by feeling only and not by concepts, what pleases or displeases, and yet does so with universal validity. It is the effect arising from the harmonious free play of our cognitive faculties when constrained by the demands of disinterest and universality. It is a mere ideal norm.
So, unless we presuppose that all human beings share this underlying fundamental identical structure that processes aesthetic information in the same way, we have no foundation for claiming necessity.
None whatsoever. The judgment of taste is laid down under the presupposition that this common sense exists as a shared condition for all knowledge. And under this presupposition, the pleasure we experience is interpreted as a consciousness of the harmonious working of imagination and understanding, depending on a relation that is necessarily valid for all men.
The necessity is subjective, it's generated internally, but it is represented as objective.
Yes. When a judgment aligns with this ideal norm, it is converted into a rule for everyone. But remember, the ought. The rule does not mean everyone will fall in with my judgment empirically. It means that everyone ought to agree with it.
Why?
Because the grounds upon which I made the judgment are universal, disinterested, and derived from the shared cognitive structure of humanity. It is a moral requirement of our shared rationality applied to the field of aesthetic feeling.
So he's saying if logic is communicable, the aesthetic structure must be as well.
That's the justification. Different beautiful objects stimulate the synthesis of imagination and understanding differently, but the capacity for that synthesis must be shared.
This entire systematic structure seems completely airtight in terms of defining the ideal judgment. But the sources highlight one last fundamental difficulty concerning this sensus communis, the one that Kant himself leaves unresolved in this initial analysis.
Yes, this is the final profound question. Does this sensus communis in fact exist as a natural constitutive principle, a hardwired faculty present from birth? Or is it formed for us as a regulative principle, by a still higher principle of reason, which seeks to beget unanimity and consensus in us?
So is taste a natural, original faculty, like sight, or is it an artificial social idea that we acquire a requirement of reason for generating consensus and community?
That's the dilemma. Does the ought of universal assent only betoken the possibility of arriving at some sort of unanimity? And is the judgment of taste merely adducing an example of reason's requirement to unify human experience and communication?
And he doesn't answer it.
He explicitly leaves this question open here, stating that resolving it would require entering the realm of the dialectic, not the analytic. We have only resolved the faculty of taste into its essential interdependent elements.
That structural dilemma perfectly sets us up for the final synthesis, where we look at the practical and social implications of these four moments. Let's move into taste as a social faculty.
The result of this entire analysis, the careful mapping of the moments, runs up into the concept of taste as a critical faculty by which an object is estimated in reference to the free conformity to law of the imagination.
And crucially, the sources note that taste is also called the sensus communis aestheticus, the aesthetic common sense.
That's right. It is a public sense. It's one which perhaps more properly deserves the name of common sense than does sound understanding, which Kant calls sensus communis logicus.
The logical common sense.
Yes, that deals with universally communicable concepts and logical truths. The sensus communis aestheticus deals with universally communicable feelings, the harmony of the faculties, giving it a more fundamental human status in Kant's view.
This immediately highlights the social dimension. Taste, therefore, is defined as the faculty of forming an a priori estimate of the communicability of the feelings connected with a representation.
This definition makes communication central to Kantian aesthetics. and it connects directly to our nature as human beings. The impulse towards society and sociability is natural to mankind. It's essential to the requirements of man as a creature intended for society and therefore belongs fundamentally to humanity.
If sociability is natural and necessary, then it is inevitable that we look upon taste as a faculty for estimating whatever enables us to communicate even our feeling to everyone else.
And hence, as a means of promoting that sociability, this is what we call the empirical interest in the beautiful. The interest that exists only in society, derived from culture, and the inclination towards joining a community. Taste is, in a sociological sense, developed through social evolution.
That explains why we spend so much time discussing, debating, and refining our taste with others. We are participating in the practice of sociability.
Exactly. Taste becomes an indispensable tool for building a unified, polite society. If we can agree on aesthetic feeling, we're halfway to agreeing on moral and conceptual issues.
But, as always with Kant, we have to apply his critical caveat here. This empirical or social interest, while real, is what?
It is of no importance for the analytic of the beautiful.
Right.
The focus of the analytic remains strictly on the a priori foundation, the transcendental meaning of the judgment. While taste is developed and refined by culture and society, the meaning of the pure judgment of taste, its authority and its necessity, must be found solely in the universal structure defined by the four moments.
The empirical development confirms the need for the ideal norm, but it doesn't define it.
Exactly.
Let's quickly review the significance of each moment within the broader critical philosophy, just to tie it all together.
Okay. The second and fourth moments, universality and necessity common sense, they mark the transcendental significance and demand critical examination. They define the judgment's scope and authority as public and demanding agreement.
The first moment, disinterestedness, defines the essential meaning for the self. It shows the influence of the practical faculty and establishes the reflective attitude of mind adopted by the subject. It is the gatekeeper of purity.
And the third moment, purposiveness without purpose, is most critical when beauty is referred back to the object as if it were a predicate. It defines what is stated about the object, albeit only a subjective relation, the free play.
What's fascinating is that these four moments aren't just a philosophical checklist. They are a system designed to isolate and define one unique, universally shared mental state required for aesthetic purity. They are the scaffolding for the a priori foundation of our entire aesthetic life.
And that foundation, the sensus communis aestheticus, is what allows us to communicate our deepest, most profound feelings, not just our logical thoughts, to every other human being. It's a remarkable, deeply humane construction for understanding why we care so much about beauty.
This has been an intensely intellectual but incredibly fruitful deep dive into a systematic architecture that manages to be both highly abstract and intensely relevant to our everyday experience. Let's summarize the core takeaways for you, the learner.
First, remember Kant's innovation. He defined beauty not by objective qualities or perfection, but by the subjective mental state required to judge it purely, shifting the focus entirely to the purity of the judgment itself.
Second, we trace the systematic link through the four moments. Disinterestedness leads to the claim of universal validity, which is grounded in the harmonious free play of imagination and understanding, all formalized by the necessary ideal norm, the sensus communis.
And third, recall the distinction between the logical priority of the reflection, the adoption of the universal standpoint and the thinking of finality, and the feeling of pleasure, which is the consequent effect arising from that successful reflection.
Now, for the provocative thought that builds on this systematic structure, let's return to the ultimate unanswered dilemma that Kant faced and that still faces us today. If the sensus communis is merely the ideal norm we must presuppose, if it's reason's ultimate goal for human consensus, and if taste develops and refines itself through social culture and the empirical interest in sociability, then we have to ask,
How much of what you call beautiful is genuinely rooted in the universal, hardwired, a priori structure Kant describes, merely waiting to be discovered?
and conversely, how much is merely the successful outcome of reason's requirement to generate social unanimity, meaning you are not discovering a universal truth, but rather successfully practicing a refined, socially necessary skill? That is what you are left to contemplate the next time you pause before something you call beautiful.